All right, hello everyone, and thank you for tuning in once again to the Black Box Podcast, BBOR, Black Box Online Radio, coming to you from West Virginia. Today we're going back to 1932, and we're visiting Stockholm, Sweden, with a rather peculiar mystery. I was reading about some true crime cases online, and I came across the case of the Atlas vampire, the vampire murder. Goes by a few names, and we're talking about the 1932 murder of Lilly Lindestrom. This, of course, comes to us from Stockholm, and it's like, what I can say is, I'm relatively new to this case, and there are some people on the internet, and they're true crime writers that spend years doing the deep dive research, and that is so valuable. I really appreciate what they do, but sometimes I think there's also another kind of value in hearing a fresh take on the subject, getting a different set of eyes to look at the case. So I've been going through some of the material, and I guess this is kind of the first impressions about the vampire murder of 1932 that I would like to talk to you guys about. Well, what we can say is, a woman named Lilly Lindestrom was found dead in her apartment. It had been a couple days after she had been murdered before the police found the body. Lilly had the only telephone in the building. I remember that another worker was trying to call her apartment. I was like, wow, did every apartment have a telephone in 1932? That was something that I noticed. And it turned out she had the only one in the building because of her profession. Lilly was a sex worker, and I mean, like, you can say she's a prostitute, call girl, whatever name you would like to use. And one of the other women in the building who was also in the same profession was trying to get in touch with her. She said, Lilly had been unresponsive, not answering the phone, so they thought something was wrong, and then the police finally arrived, and they found her murdered. Bludgeoned in the head, multiple strikes to the back of the head, which caused her death. But the reason why this is called the vampire murder is they found what I guess you describe as a gravy ladle, kind of a thing that you use out of a gravy boat or the gravy dish, and that was covered in blood. When this was first referred to as the vampire murder, the immediate image that came to mind was I was picturing a woman that had been bitten on the neck. When you hear vampire, that's what you think. I was picturing a woman that had been savagely bitten on the neck. That's what I thought they were going to say, but in reality, she was struck in the head multiple times, and again, they just found this ladle that had been blood-stained, and they think that the killer was perhaps drinking her blood. Okay, there's a big thing we got to say about true crime cases when you're going back decades. Some of the lesser-known true crime cases, it's like the details might be lost to history. The details might have gone up in smoke. The precise information might be very difficult for us to get as the general public. I'm seeing all sorts of conflicting information about this. Like whatever website or video you're watching on this case might give you a different take on the subject. Some things say that her body was completely drained of blood. Other things say that, they just found this gravy-stained ladle nearby, and they kind of thought that was used to drink blood. There's an enormous difference between someone trying to drink some of her blood and having all the blood drained from her body. Do I think that this killer, this murderer, actually drained all the blood from her body? No, I don't, because I actually saw a comment on a forum, not really a forum, like someone had written an article in the comment section of somebody's post, and it's like someone was thinking exactly what I was thinking. To drain the blood out of someone's body, normally, like, I'm thinking 1932, you would have to suspend the person from the air, or at least hang them upside down. Very unlikely that all the blood was drained from her body. Also, I was on this one, a different website, and I actually found kind of someone who used to live in the building. Like, this one person was on WordPress of all things, and she was writing about how she saw a documentary on the subject. Someone who lives in Sweden, speaks Swedish, and there was a Swedish language documentary about this, and they're like, holy crap, that's the building we live in. So they actually got some full floor plans of the building to see if they were in the actual apartment where the murder took place, and it turns out they were not, but they lived very close by, like only 2 units away. But the things that they kind of pointed out once again, they're watching the Swedish language documentary, and they were able to actually get the original news clipping. Like, they put a photograph of it, once again, all in Swedish language, so I rely on her translations for it. If I can go back and find that WordPress article, I'll post it in the comments section. It's written by someone named Gloria. That was her name. But the thing that she's saying is that she believed that the journalists involved with the case were trying to blow things out of proportion, sensationalize, exaggerate, and I believe the exact word she used was fantasy-filled journalists were trying to turn this into the vampire murder, when in reality it's like a woman who was a prostitute, a sex worker. She was murdered, beaten to death, and there was even a condom that was sticking out of her anus, hanging out of her anus, we should say. And that condom apparently did have semen in it. So says one account. Also, they said that they found saliva on her neck and body. So, lots of physical evidence. But, this is 1932 again. Like DNA, DNA was in its infancy back in the 90s, if I recall. That's one of the things that, they dealt with in the O.J. Simpson case. And I don't really mean that no one dealt with DNA before the 90s, but we're talking about bringing it into mainstream investigations and such. But they definitely talked about that in the O.J. Simpson case. Barry Scheck and all that. We don't need to go down that road. Alright, so, what happened? Was this a vampire? Supernatural attack? Was somebody hanging her upside down and draining the blood out of her body? I don't personally think either one of those things were going on. I really do notice that journalists can often get carried away with the subject. Fantasy-filled journalists. Do we have enough of those in the world? It's just like, I'm noticing a pattern here. I'm noticing this trend and similarity. Sometimes I get the feeling that the journalist just feels like, oh wow, it's such a better story if I write it this way. So they compose things and they get fluffy on the details. Maybe they even add in things that aren't 100% true, but they're kind of just doing a little bit of guesswork, or they think that it's just a more attractive thing. We saw this from other cases, like perhaps the disappearance of Joan Risch or something like that. One of my personal hypotheses in that is that there was a journalist that got involved and just really wanted to write a story in a particular way, as well as something like Amanda Knox even. I did a whole episode on Amanda Knox called The Perverted Police, which was talking about how the police officers and the journalists in the Amanda Knox case could not escape their perversions, and they just had to turn it into some sort of sex story, some sort of international sex ring. Well, it sounds like a very similar thing is going on here with the case of Lilly Lindestrom in Stockholm, Sweden, 1932. Once again, I don't speak Swedish. I can see the clip of the article, but I'm relying purely on someone's interpretations and what they say is in there. But at the same time, it really seems like they found a blood-stained ladle. And there's another thing that this girl Gloria writes in her blog. I have no idea how old she is. This woman Gloria writes in her blog. I don't want to call someone a girl and it turns out she's like 68 years old or something. This woman Gloria has been writing that the ladle was actually found outside of the apartment, kind of like near the building, but like sort of in the kind of yard area, the yard in front of the building. But because when I'm listening to other things, like there's this YouTube video out there from Limbo that I thought did a nice presentation, but that was saying that the ladle was found in the room, and it's just a conflict. Going back to 1932 that far, the details are just going to be changing so fast. It's like a game of telephone or Chinese whispers. The details are really going to be changing fast from person to person. We have conflicting information, but what I can say about that is, either way, it seems like they have this blood-stained ladle, and they interpreted that as perhaps someone was either drinking her blood directly, or perhaps gathering like amounts of blood on the ladle and pouring it over food. That's another possibility that they discussed. One thing that I thought about was, could somebody have been using her blood for some sort of like experiments or research or something? They needed human blood and they couldn't get a hold of it. I don't know. People are weird. I'm just throwing that out there. But how do we get to this point? We've talked about how maybe we're eliminating some of the vampire things. How do we get to this point where Lilly Lindestrom gets murdered? She's a sex worker. There's a condom found hanging out of her anus. one of the things that I thought was perhaps one of her clients was trying to initiate anal sex with her, and Lilly really was trying to refuse, and that person got angry and then just started striking her, because I believe that the blows were done to the back of the head, where they struck her with some sort of blunt object. I mean, it could be like a club, probably could have been the backside of a gun or something like that, or any sort of thing. I mean, blunt force trauma. So, like, I mean, it's one of the possibilities that I entertained. It also seems like, so she's with somebody and perhaps things just got out of control. Definitely if she's trying to refuse something, or even if this person is just kind of like overwhelmed or something, lost control of what they were doing, and they just kind of disappeared out into the night and then they weren't seen again. Now, one of the things, though, they did track down 8 of her regular clients, like, the regulars that would come visit her, and I believe they were all investigated. What we can say is that the murder's unsolved. None of them were ever arrested. None of them stood trial. Perhaps the police didn't have enough to make an arrest on any of these people. So, where does that leave us? I'm still going with the theory that this was a new client, probably somebody that had seen Lilly for either the first or second time, most likely the first time, someone who was just being very forceful. There's probably some resistance, and then either that or this was genuinely some serial killer. We were just talking about the Highway of Tears on the channel a couple days ago. We did an upload on the Highway of Tears, which is a place in Canada, which is kind of like a sort of fertile ground for serial killers because they can get away with it. Is this just some killer who just thought that Lilly Lindestrom would be in a vulnerable place? They could commit this murder and commit the kind of sex act and get away with it, then disappear into the night? Very possibly, very possibly. What do we make of the bloodstained ladle then? If this wasn't a vampire, was somebody really drinking her blood? I talked about the possibility that this could be something such as, someone is collecting the blood for some sort of other experiment. I mean, I think it's very, very ambiguous. I mean, it's very difficult to just sort of look at this kind of bloody ladle and be like, it means anything, this, that, and the other, without getting a few more details. So perhaps we'll do like a second part of the vampire murder, the Atlas vampire, whatever you'd like to call it. Atlas, by the way, just refers to the neighborhood that this took place in. Now, one of the things, though, that we can say is, I definitely would lean toward the fact, though, we said this is something maybe a journalist blew this out of proportion, trying to say that some maniac is drinking her blood. Not necessarily. I mean, one of the things that just came to mind right now, maybe this is too far out. If anyone in the comments section is listening right now, if anyone wants to jot this down, is it possible that, the ladle could be like one of the objects that he struck her in the head with? It could be other things. Definitely a little gravy ladle isn't strong enough to probably produce the fatal blows in the skull. No, I really don't think that, but that could be something else that was just kind of thrown at her, or, like throwing objects at somebody, or just getting angry and trying to strike her with something, and that's why it was covered in blood. I think it might actually make a little bit more sense if that were found outside the room. That would kind of mean that some guy's trying to get away and he has some bloody object with him, and then the ladle falls out. And that's why they would find it in the yard as opposed to in the bedroom. Once again, I'm really not insisting that, that was the object that did the fatal blows. That could be just, something that maybe he threw it at her or something in an angry moment. But the condom was found in the anus. Were they having anal sex and then he struck her in the back of the head? Or did he, maybe she refused anal sex and then he beat her to death. Then he did it post-mortem, then he kind of anally raped her after she was dead. People do stuff like that. And based on the way the body was found, based on the blows to the back of the head, it's very possible that that's what happened, that she was refusing anal sex, so he started beating her in the back of the head, bends her over, and then he tries to sodomize her. This is all theoretical. Once again, this is just a completely first impression based approach. Someone who's a newcomer to the case. There actually is an entire book about this that's available on Amazon, and I would definitely like to try and get my hands on that if I get the chance. I mean, it's a fascinating case, as disgusting as it is, where you would kind of like, you would want to know more, and also, the murderer was never caught. Someone got away with murder. I'm not going to rule it out. This could also be the work of some sort of serial killer where someone's preying on prostitutes. Have you ever heard of that before? Serial killers preying on prostitutes? Can you name any other possible serial killer that has been preying on sex workers? People do things like that. Why? Because they're in a vulnerable position. So, I would definitely hope that maybe we can explore the Atlas vampire murder a little bit more, the case of Lilly Lindestrom. Another reason why this one caught my eye was, have you ever heard that story about Lilith? Lilith was the first vampire on Earth. You ever heard that? It's kind of like a retelling of Adam and Eve, and Adam's first wife was actually Lilith, and Lilith went on to become the world's first vampire. And then I saw her name was Lilly Lindestrom, and I just something that catches your eye, but I don't really know if that's probably just purely a coincidence. I think the vampire stuff really comes from what that girl Gloria wrote. That woman Gloria wrote. I mean, that this was the work of some kind of fantasy-filled journalist who wanted to blow the story out of proportion to make their newspaper articles a little more attractive. Well, we're going to explore this case a little bit more and see if we can kind of learn a little bit more about this theory that she was beaten to death for refusing a sex act, raped post-mortem. I mean, that doesn't necessarily explain why there's blood on this ladle, unless, that was just something that the guy threw at her during, like, an argument or something like that. I mean, or there are a variety of ways that could have gotten, that blood could have gotten on the ladle. But we can explore that a little bit more. So this is kind of maybe the first of many episodes about the murder of Lilly Lindestrom from Stockholm, Sweden, 1932.